I often think back to when life felt simpler. Back then, Susan and I had shared dreams, goals, and laughter. Every morning, we'd sit on the porch with our coffee, talking about our plans for the future. Those conversations kept us close, even as life became more complicated. We met in college in Colorado, and together we carved out a life built on shared values, trust, and mutual support. After graduation, I went straight into oil exploration, and Susan pursued her passion for academia and research. In those early days, we were ambitious and idealistic but never too busy for each other. Even though our careers were demanding, we made it work. 5 years into our marriage, things began to change. My work as a geologist involved long stretches in remote areas, and Susan grew deeply involved in her PhD work. Yet we still tried to connect when we could, ignoring the subtle changes building between us. Lately, though, the distance between us has felt like more than a side effect of our busy schedules. Susan returned 2 months ago from an extended research trip in Utah, studying a secluded splinter group of the Mormon Church. I expected her return to bring us closer, but instead, things became strange. Since she came back, Susan has been a different person. She locked herself away in her study, completely absorbed in her thesis. Even when we're together, it's as if there's an invisible wall between us. When she first came home, I noticed how differently she dressed. Once, she liked trendy clothes, maybe a touch of makeup and perfume. Now, she wears long, conservative dresses that cover her from neck to ankle, her hair tied tightly in a bun. Even at night, she wears plain, high-necked nightgowns. She says her new style keeps her focused, but it feels like she's trying to become a different person. It wasn't just her clothing, she also seemed physically unwell, with a stomach issue she picked up in Utah. Despite constant nausea, she refused to see a doctor. I've tried asking her about her research, her health, or her plans, but each time, she dismisses my questions. "You wouldn't understand," she said when I pressed her to talk about Utah. She promised she'd explain everything once her thesis was complete. But what once felt like a partnership now feels like 2 separate lives. I see her slipping further away, and no matter how much I try, I can't bridge the distance between us. Her secrecy weighs heavily on me, and I can't ignore the questions circling in my mind. Her research involved living with a secluded, closed-off community for 2 months. She said the area had no phones or internet access, though that seemed unlikely. What was she doing there that she refuses to talk about now? I want to believe she was simply focused on her work, but something about her story just doesn't add up. I wonder how she gained the trust of this group so quickly. Did they know she was studying them? What exactly did she experience there? These questions haunt me, and Susan's unwillingness to share only deepens my suspicions. For the first time in our marriage, I feel truly isolated, as if Susan's intentionally keeping me out. I've never known her to be secretive, yet now she locks her study door, keeps her computer password protected, and has moved my things to the dining room. Our conversations have become increasingly strained, and each attempt I make to connect is met with irritation or silence. When I brought up the distance between us, she grew defensive, claiming I didn't understand the pressures of her research. It's as if she's become a stranger, someone living a separate life right under our roof. As the days pass, the quiet tension builds, and the home we once shared feels emptier. Our lives are so far apart that I fear we're lost to each other, 2 people orbiting in separate worlds. I'm beginning to question everything I thought I knew about her, and about us. I don't know what I'm more afraid of, the truth or the possibility that I may never know it. The more time passed, the clearer it became that Susan was hiding something from me. I tried to be patient, believing that she'd open up once the thesis was done, but the secrecy began to wear on me. When she returned, she wouldn't talk about her time in Utah, wouldn't share her research experiences, and barely even acknowledged me. Even simple questions, like asking about her health or her daily plans, were met with tension or irritation. Each time I tried to connect, she pushed me further away. Her sudden focus on finishing her thesis seemed obsessive. She had 2 years left to complete it, but now she was rushing to finish, saying she wanted to return to teaching as soon as possible. When I asked where she was applying for jobs, she brushed me off, claiming she hadn't decided yet. I offered to help, but she firmly told me to stay out of it. For the first time in our marriage, Susan was making major decisions without me, and the more she shut me out, the more I started questioning everything. Susan's strange behavior grew harder to ignore. In her new conservative wardrobe, she looked like a different person. Her once vibrant, fashionable style had been replaced with drab, modest clothing, which she insisted helped her focus. At night, she wore high-necked nightgowns, refusing even the simplest intimacy. Whenever I tried to initiate closeness, she turned away, saying any physical contact would complicate her research. It was as if she no longer wanted to be my wife, as if intimacy was something she had locked away along with everything else. One evening, after weeks of tension and silence, I confronted her. I demanded to know what was going on, why she'd changed, why she was shutting me out, why she refused to even talk about Utah. Her reaction was defensive and angry, as if I'd crossed a line. She snapped that I didn't understand her work and wouldn't answer any questions until her thesis was finished. I told her that this secrecy was destroying our relationship, and that I needed to know if I was still part of her life. She grimaced, gave a tight smile, and promised she would explain everything soon. But that wasn't enough. I couldn't live in this state of confusion and distance, feeling like a stranger in my own home. One morning, as I watched her head out the door for another meeting with her thesis advisor, I noticed a change in her appearance. Her usually flat stomach had a slight, unmistakable bump. A cold shock hit me. Susan was pregnant. Given the timing, there was no chance that I was the father. I confronted her immediately, demanding answers. At first, she denied it, but under pressure, she finally admitted the truth. Susan confessed that she'd become involved with Henry, the leader of the secluded community she had stayed with. She claimed it began as coercion, explaining that he held total control over her while she was there. At first, she resisted, but over time, she felt trapped and eventually gave in, convincing herself that submitting was the only way to complete her research. Her words were raw, painting a picture of isolation, fear, and control. She revealed that she had been drawn back into the world of her childhood, a polygamous lifestyle that her mother had fled from years ago. I sat in shock, barely able to process what she was saying. She described how Henry had demanded complete submission, treating her as a wife while she lived in his household. He controlled her actions, her appearance, even her clothing. She hadn't told me any of this before, claiming that she wanted to protect me from the details until she finished her thesis. She insisted that she had felt powerless to stop what happened. But as she spoke, there was a glint in her eye that I couldn't ignore. She described how, over time, she had started to accept, maybe even enjoy, the submissive role she'd been forced into. It was as if a part of her was captivated by the very lifestyle that had once driven her mother to escape. As she continued, my anger flared. I couldn't believe that she'd kept this from me, that she had let herself be drawn so deeply into that world. I couldn't understand how she could betray our marriage, both physically and emotionally. I demanded to know why she had chosen to stay silent, why she had let it go this far. She offered a hollow apology, saying that she thought I would understand in time, that I would forgive her if I knew the full story. But her words rang empty. At that moment, I felt a mix of betrayal, anger, and hurt that I'd never experienced before. I couldn't believe the person standing before me was the same woman I had married. She tried to rationalize her actions, saying it was all part of her research, but I couldn't accept it. To her, maybe it was some academic exploration, but to me, it was the end of everything I thought we shared. As Susan continued, the truth only became more painful. She explained that her research involved blending into this secluded community by embracing their way of life completely. She admitted that her pregnancy was a result of being pressured by Henry, the community leader, who took her in as his wife while she lived there. Her voice shook as she described how she felt forced at first, but over time, she started accepting the dynamic, even convincing herself that it was necessary for her thesis. She claimed it was all for the research, her rationalization felt hollow, and her refusal to be accountable only deepened my rage. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. Susan, my wife, had lived as the fourth wife of a man who embodied the very culture she once studied with an outsider's curiosity. The woman I loved had willingly entered a relationship she once would have condemned as restrictive and oppressive. Now, she was admitting that she had started to view this lifestyle as more than just research, telling me that the community's culture had certain appeals she found hard to ignore. I felt like I'd lost her entirely, not just to another person, but to an entirely different life, a life in which I didn't belong. Trying to stay calm, I asked if she planned to stay with me, if she intended to rebuild our life together, knowing the damage that had been done. She hesitated, looking away. Then, in a low voice, she said she wasn't sure. Susan said she felt conflicted, torn between the life we'd built and this new reality she'd encountered. She admitted to feeling drawn back to Henry and the community, and her research had shifted into a personal choice that left me reeling. She was actually considering leaving me and returning to the community, with our marriage and all we had shared reduced to a secondary option in her mind. My anger boiled over. I demanded to know if she still loved me, or if she had any respect left for our marriage. She struggled to respond, telling me that love had become complicated for her, that she didn't feel she could make a choice until her thesis was completely finished. I felt betrayed, abandoned by the woman I'd once trusted above all others. Our once strong relationship had disintegrated into this fractured, incomprehensible mess. Fueled by a mix of heartbreak and desperation, I decided to confront Henry himself. I wanted him to know the chaos he'd unleashed, and I wanted answers that only he could give. As Susan begged me to let it go, I resolved to take matters into my own hands. I called in a few favors and arranged a short trip, telling my boss I'd be gone for a couple of weeks. With meticulous planning, I tracked Henry's whereabouts and the schedule of his daily routines. After days of preparation, I finally arrived at the edge of his community. Disguised and fully prepared, I found him on his farmland, alone. Rage and adrenaline drove me forward. I confronted him with my presence, making sure he knew exactly who I was. I wanted him to see the face of the man whose life he'd torn apart. With a calm intensity, I gave him a warning, a message that I, Susan's husband, was not to be crossed. I left him with a brutal reminder of his own twisted actions, an action as irreversible as the damage he had caused me. Without looking back, I left him there to face his own community, disgraced and humiliated in the way he had humiliated me. Returning home, I felt a strange sense of closure. The confrontation had not erased my pain, nor had it restored the life Susan and I once shared, but it had given me back some control. I couldn't undo what Susan had done, couldn't erase the betrayal, but I knew I had done what I could to reclaim my dignity. In the following days, Susan seemed quieter, subdued. She sensed that things had reached a breaking point, though she didn't know exactly what had happened in that remote town. Our final conversations were hollow, filled with words that once meant everything and now felt empty. She asked if we could move past everything, start fresh, but I couldn't find it in myself to believe her. The love we had built was beyond repair, and all I could see was the gulf between us, filled with lies and broken promises. We filed for divorce soon after. The process was painful but quick, both of us knowing there was nothing left to salvage. Susan moved out, taking her things and the remnants of our shared life, leaving me with a house that felt as empty as I did. We split everything equally, our belongings, the house sale, even the memories we had once cherished. And as the papers were signed, I knew I had reached the end of a chapter, painful but necessary. The following months were a blur. I focused on work, took on a new project overseas, and gradually let go of the life we'd planned together. Friends and family supported me, though I kept the details to myself, unwilling to let anyone else bear the weight of this twisted story. In time, I found myself beginning to heal, not fully whole but stronger, ready to rebuild. Looking back, I understood that Susan and I had changed, each in different ways, each seeking fulfillment we couldn't find in each other. Our love had been real once, a bond that felt unbreakable, but life had taken us down paths that ultimately led to our undoing. Now, as I stepped forward into a life I had to rebuild on my own terms, I carried only what I had learned, leaving the rest behind. If you want to hear more stories like this, click on the video you see on your screen, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more content.